Long before churches cast shadows across Eastern Europe, before borders were drawn and names were written into chronicles, there was a quieter world breathing beneath the forest floor, a world where people did not ask whether the gods were real, because their presence was felt in every sound and movement around them, in the low roll of distant thunder, in the way mist clung to riverbanks at dawn, in the creak of old trees swaying under the weight of unseen winds. These gods were not statues on pedestals. They were neighbors. They were dangers. They were protectors. And today, most of their names are barely whispered, if they are remembered at all. Imagine standing alone at the edge of an ancient forest as night begins to fall. There is no road behind you, no village light ahead. Only trees, thick, dark, endless, stretching into the unknown. Somewhere inside that darkness, something is listening. The early Slavs believed this without hesitation. To them, the world was alive in a way modern life rarely allows us to feel. Stones remembered footsteps. Rivers carried stories. Fire was never just fire. Everything had intention, memory, and mood. What makes this realization unsettling is not that these beliefs existed, but that they vanished so quietly. No single moment marked their end. No final prayer was spoken. Instead, the old god sank slowly into the soil, absorbed by moss, hidden behind new symbols and borrowed names. They became bedtime warnings for children, half-forgotten customs, strange superstitions no one could fully explain. And yet, traces remain, embedded deep in the cultural roots of lands stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Balkans. For the ancient Slavs, the world was not divided into sacred and ordinary. There was no sharp boundary between myth and daily survival. When crops failed, it was not bad weather, it was imbalance. When storms tore across the sky, it was not coincidence, it was conflict. Every action echoed somewhere beyond human sight. To live was to negotiate constantly with unseen forces, hoping to remain unnoticed by some, favored by others. This worldview created a relationship with fear that was strangely gentle. Fear was not panic, it was awareness. You respected the forest because it could shelter you or swallow you whole. You honored water because it gave life, but it could also claim it. Even death was not an ending in the modern sense. It was a transition, a movement deeper into the same living system that governed the waking world. The gods of the Slavs did not demand perfection. They demanded attention. Forgetting them was more dangerous than angering them. And perhaps that is why their disappearance feels so haunting now. When belief fades slowly, it leaves behind a hollow silence rather than ruins. No temples to marvel at, no epics carved into stone, only forests that feel older than they should, and stories that seem to remember more than we do. These gods were shaped by the land itself. Vast plains taught patience. Long winters taught endurance. Dense forests taught caution. Life was uncertain, fragile, and deeply connected to forces no human could control. Instead of trying to conquer nature, the Slavic peoples learned to listen to it. Their myths were not about domination, but balance between sky and soil, life and decay, light and shadow. In this balance lived countless beings, not all of them gods in the grand sense. Spirits watched over homes, fields, rivers, crossroads. Some were kind, some were dangerous, most were unpredictable, and yet they were accepted as part of reality. Just as weather and time were accepted, to ignore them was foolish. To understand them was survival. As centuries passed, new beliefs arrived with sharper edges and clearer rules. Gods became singular. Stories became fixed. The old ways, fluid and rooted in landscape, did not vanish overnight, but they could not compete with certainty. Slowly, the forest gods lost their names. River spirits were reduced to fairy tales. Thunder no longer spoke. And the world grew quieter. But quiet does not mean empty. Even now, when the wind moves through tall trees at night, it carries a weight that feels older than language. Even now, certain places feel wrong to linger in, while others bring unexplainable calm. These sensations are not accidents. They are echoes, remnants of a time when humans believed the world was watching them just as closely as they watched it. This story is not about reviving belief, nor about proving what is true or false. It is about remembering how people once understood their place in the vastness of existence, how they lived inside myth rather than above it, how their gods were not distant rulers, but reflections of the land itself, wild, nurturing, dangerous, and enduring. As you listen, allow the pace to slow. Let the images form gently without effort. Think of firelight flickering against wooden walls, of voices lowered at night, careful not to offend what might be listening. Think of a world where sleep itself was a vulnerable act, entrusted protective spirits, and quiet prayers spoken without words. Because the old Slavic gods were never truly gone. They were buried, and like seeds beneath the soil, they have waited patiently, silently, for someone to listen again. Before ink ever touched parchment, before names were fixed and histories agreed upon, the Slavic world existed in a state of flowing memory. Nothing was written down because nothing needed to be. Knowledge lived in voices, in gestures, in repeated actions performed at the right time of year. Stories were not owned by individuals. They belonged to the land, and people simply carried them for a while before passing them on. In this world, memory was not fragile. It was reinforced every season, every harvest, every long winter night spent near the fire. The early Slavs did not see themselves as standing apart from nature. There was no sense of separation between human and world. A village was not something built against the wilderness, but something carefully placed within it. Homes were raised where the land allowed, fields cleared only as much as necessary. Forests were never fully conquered, only negotiated with. To cut down a tree was not a casual act. It was a decision that carried weight, intention, and sometimes ritual apology. Time moved differently in such a world. Without written calendars or exact dates, life followed rhythms rather than schedules. The return of birds mattered more than numbers. The thickness of snow, the smell of thawing soil, the angle of the sun, these were the true markers of passing days. People understood time not as something that marched forward, but as something that circled back upon itself. What had happened before would happen again, slightly altered, but familiar. Children learned the world not through instruction, but through immersion. They absorbed meaning by watching elders work the land, prepare food, speak carefully at certain places, fall silent at others. Stories were told without urgency, often repeated many times with small changes, because exact wording mattered less than the feeling they left behind. A myth was successful if it lingered in the listener's mind, not if it was perfectly remembered. In the absence of writing, forgetting was dangerous. This is why repetition mattered so deeply. Rituals were performed the same way each year, not because people feared punishment, but because consistency maintained balance. A missed gesture, a neglected offering, or an ignored sign could ripple outward in unseen ways. Misfortune was rarely random. It was usually understood as a sign that something had been overlooked. The world itself was believed to be listening, not in a judging way, but in an attentive one. Words spoken aloud had power because they entered the shared space between humans and unseen forces. Silence, too, had meaning. There were moments when speech was avoided entirely, especially at night or in unfamiliar territory. Darkness was not feared, but respected. It was a time when boundaries softened, when the ordinary rules loosened their grip. Without written law, morality was shaped by survival and memory. Stories taught consequences more effectively than commands. A tale about someone who disrespected the river and vanished beneath its surface lingered longer than any warning sign ever could. These stories were not meant to terrify, but to remind listeners that actions matter beyond what could be immediately seen. The lack of written records also meant that gods were not frozen into fixed forms. They shifted from region to region, from generation to generation. A spirit known in one valley might be unknown in the next. Names changed. Roles overlapped. Contradictions were not problems. They were signs of life. Belief was flexible, adapting to local landscapes and experiences. This fluidity allowed myths to survive for centuries without becoming rigid or fragile. Elders held a special place in this society, not because of authority, but because of memory. They remembered winters others had not lived through. They recalled famines, floods, strange omens in the sky. Their stories carried practical knowledge disguised as myth. When an elder spoke, People listened, not out of obligation, but because experience itself was sacred. Death, too, was woven seamlessly into life. Without written genealogies, ancestors lived on through spoken remembrance. Names were repeated, deeds recalled. The dead were not distant. They remained part of the household, part of the land. Burial sites were chosen carefully, often close to where life had been lived, reinforcing the idea that the boundary between worlds was thin and permeable. In such a world, certainty was rare, but meaning was everywhere. People did not seek absolute explanations. They accepted mystery as a natural state. The unknown was not something to be solved, but something to live alongside. This acceptance created a quiet resilience. When disasters came, and they often did, people endured not because they believed they could control fate, but because they trusted the rhythms that had always returned before. When writing eventually arrived, it did not capture this world fully. Words on a page struggled to hold beliefs that had never been static. What survived in chronicles, and later folklore, was only a shadow of a much richer, lived reality. The deepest parts of Slavic belief were never meant to be written. They were meant to be felt, in the ache of cold mornings, in the relief of spring warmth, in the shared silence before sleep. And perhaps this is why the ancient Slavic world feels so distant now. Not because it was simple or primitive, but because it required a kind of attention modern life rarely demands. To live without writing was to live fully present, anchored in place, season, and community. It was to trust memory more than records, intuition more than instruction. As the centuries moved forward and new systems replaced old rhythms, much of this way of seeing the world faded. But its foundation remains buried beneath language itself, in pauses, in habits that seem to come from nowhere, in moments when the world feels briefly alive again, listening back. To understand how the ancient Slavs saw everything around them, one must first let go of the idea that the world was flat, simple, or singular. For them, reality rose upward and sank downward at the same time, layered with meaning, memory, and unseen movement. The universe was not an empty sky above solid ground. It was a living structure, held together by an immense, sacred form that connected all things. This form was not always named the same way, but it was always understood, a great tree standing at the center of existence. In the minds of the early Slavs, this tree did not grow in any ordinary forest. Its roots reached far below the visible earth. Deep into damp, shadowed realms where decay and rebirth intertwined. Its trunk stood firmly in the human world, where villages were built, fires were lit, and lives unfolded day by day. Its branches stretched upward beyond sight, into bright and shifting skies where powerful forces moved freely. Every level of reality existed simultaneously, bound together by this unseen axis. The upper realm was associated with light, height, and movement. It was where winds were born and storms gathered their strength. Birds crossing the sky were not merely animals in flight. They were messengers passing between worlds. When thunder rolled, it was not an impersonal sound. It was a voice echoing through the branches of the cosmic tree, reminding those below that the heavens were active and aware. The middle realm, the one humans inhabited, was not considered more important than the others. It was simply the place of balance, where forces met and mixed. Here, people lived under constant influence from above and below. Their actions could tilt harmony in either direction. This understanding created a deep sense of responsibility. Every choice mattered because it resonated outward, touching unseen roots and distant branches. Beneath the surface of the earth lay the lower realm, a place often misunderstood by later interpretations. It was not purely a land of punishment or evil. It was moist, dark, and fertile. Seeds vanished into it only to return transformed. Ancestors rested there, not in silence, but in quiet continuity. Water flowed through this realm, carrying memory and power. The lower world was where things ended, so they could begin again. The tree itself was not worshipped as an object, but respected as a symbol of order. It represented connection rather than hierarchy. No realm existed without the others. If the roots were disturbed, the branches would suffer. If the sky grew violent, the earth below would feel it. Balance was not static. It required constant adjustment, much like the seasons themselves. This way of seeing the cosmos shaped how people understood their place within it. Humans were not at the center. They lived on the trunk, halfway between sky and soil, always influenced by forces beyond their control. Humility was not taught through doctrine, but through observation. A failed harvest, an unexpected storm, or a sudden illness reminded everyone how fragile their position truly was. Certain places in the natural world were believed to echo the structure of the cosmic tree. Tall oaks, especially ancient ones, were seen as reflections of this greater form. Their roots tangled deep underground, their branches spread wide, and their trunks bore the marks of countless seasons. To stand beneath such a tree was to stand closer to the structure of reality itself. People spoke more softly there. Some did not speak at all. Rivers, too, were seen as pathways between realms, flowing across the land, emerging from hidden springs and disappearing beyond the horizon. They mirror the movement between worlds. Crossing a river was not just a physical act. It symbolized transition. This is why many rituals, offerings, and stories involved water. It marked the boundary where one state of being could quietly become another. Night and day followed the same layered logic. Day belonged more to the upper realm, filled with light and activity. Night drew the world closer to the lower realms, when dreams became vivid and boundaries thinned. Sleep itself was considered a temporary journey, a gentle descent into another layer of existence. This belief lent sleep a sense of vulnerability and sacredness. One did not drift off carelessly. One surrendered. Animals were thought to move between these layers more easily than humans. A snake slipping into the earth, a bird rising into the sky, a wolf disappearing into forest. All seemed to understand pathways humans could not see. This is why animals featured so prominently in Slavic myth. They were not symbols in the abstract sense. They were participants in the same cosmic system, guided by instincts that aligned them more closely with the world's deeper structure. This layered universe also explained misfortune without stripping it of meaning. When something went wrong, it was often understood as a disruption somewhere along the great axis. Perhaps something below had been neglected. Perhaps something above had been angered. The solution was rarely force. It was attention. Offering silence, patience, and remembrance were ways to restore balance. What makes this worldview so striking is how seamlessly it blends the visible and invisible. There was no sharp line between imagination and reality. The cosmic tree was not a distant myth told for entertainment. It was a framework through which everything was understood. People did not need to see it to know it was there. Its presence was felt in the way life unfolded, predictably and unpredictably at once. As later beliefs replaced these ideas, the image of the world flattened. Sky became empty space. Earth became matter. The underworld became something to fear rather than understand. But traces of the old structure linger, in the way we still describe family roots, in the instinct to look upward for hope and downward for origins, in the quiet comfort of standing beneath a great tree and feeling, without explanation, that it has seen more than we ever will. The ancient Slavs did not try to escape this structure or master it. They lived within it, accepting their place along its trunk, aware of the vastness above and below. Their myths did not promise control. They offered orientation, a way to know where one stood in a world that was alive, layered, and endlessly interconnected. And in moments of stillness, when the noise of the modern world fades, that old structure can almost be sensed again, a feeling that everything is connected by something unseen, that the ground beneath you and the sky above are part of the same living whole, that you, too, are standing quietly along the trunk of something far older than memory. High above the forests and rivers, beyond the reach of human hands, there was a presence the ancient Slavs felt more often than they ever saw. It announced itself not through vision, but through sound. A low rumble rolling across the sky. A sudden crack splitting the air. Thunder was never just weather. It was a sign that something immense had stirred, that the upper realm was awake and moving. The sky was not empty to the early Slavs. It was alive, watching, and capable of sudden change. Clouds were not passive shapes drifting overhead, but gatherings of power. Lightning was not random. It was purposeful, striking where imbalance had grown too great. When storms came, people listened carefully, because the sky did not speak often, but when it did, Its voice carried authority. The great sky god was imagined as a force of order, not gentle, but necessary. He was associated with law, oaths, and the invisible lines that held society together. Promises spoken beneath the open sky carried more weight than those whispered indoors. To lie while thunder echoed above was dangerous, because the sky was believed to hear such things clearly. Unlike distant creator gods found in other traditions, this divine presence was not removed from daily life. He moved constantly, riding storms across the heavens, watching over fields, warriors, and wanderers alike. His favor was not guaranteed. Respect mattered more than devotion. He was not appeased by words alone, but by action, by keeping one's word, by honoring boundaries, by standing firm when tested. When lightning struck a tree or split a stone, it was not seen as destruction without reason. It was a mark, a reminder that the world was not fully under human control. Some places touched by lightning became sacred, avoided, or carefully respected. Others were seen as chosen, infused a lingering energy that could protect or harm depending on how it was approached. Storm brought both fear and relief. They could flatten crops, flood rivers, and tear roofs from homes. But they also brought rain to dry fields, cooled the air after heavy heat, and renewed the land. This dual nature was deeply understood. Power was never simple. What protected could also destroy. What punished could also restore balance. The sky god's connection to weapons, especially axes or hammers, reflected this belief. These tools mirrored lightning itself, sudden, decisive, capable of reshaping the world in a single strike. Warriors invoked the sky not for cruelty, but for clarity. Battle was chaos, and chaos needed order to survive it. Victory was not always about strength, but alignment with the forces that governed fate. Thunderstorms often marked moments of transition, the changing of seasons, the start of important journeys, the outbreak or end of conflict. When the sky roared, it was believed that unseen struggles were unfolding above, echoing into the human world. These were not distant myths. They were explanations for why life could change so quickly, without warning. Silence followed storms with particular significance. After thunder passed and rain softened into mist, the world felt briefly cleansed. The air was different. Sounds carried farther. This quiet was respected. People moved carefully, aware that the sky had just spoken and might still be listening. Children were taught early not to mock thunder or lightning. Such disrespect invited attention, and attention from the upper realm was not something to seek lightly. Fear, in this sense, was not terror but humility, knowing one's place beneath a vast and unpredictable sky. Even animals were believed to sense the mood of the heavens. Sudden stillness before a storm was watched closely. Birds falling silent, wind shifting direction. These were warnings, gentle nudges to prepare. Humans were not separate from these signs. They were expected to notice, to respond, to adapt. Over time, as beliefs shifted and names changed, the sky lost much of its voice. Thunder became a scientific explanation. Lightning became electricity. But the instinctive response remains. Even now, a sudden storm can quiet a room. Even now, thunder can make people pause, listen, feel small in a way that is strangely grounding. For the ancient Slavs, this feeling was constant. The sky was always there, always capable of reminding them that they lived beneath something vast and alive. They did not seek to dominate it. They sought to live in rhythm with it, knowing that order was fragile and had to be maintained. And when thunder rolled across the land at night, echoing through forests and over rivers, it carried more than sound. It carried memory, a reminder that above the visible world, something ancient still moved, still watched, and still held the power to change everything in a single, blinding moment. Beneath the firm ground where villages stood and crops grew, the ancient Slavs imagined another world unfolding in silence and shadow. This lower realm was not a place one looked toward with dread alone, but with caution, respect, and a deep sense of inevitability. It was damp and dark, not because it was evil, but because it was hidden. Life disappeared into it, and life emerged from it again. Nothing truly ended there. It only changed its form. The earth itself was seen as a threshold rather than a barrier. When seeds were pressed into soil, they vanished from sight, entrusted to forces unseen. When the dead were buried, they were not cast away, but returned. The ground closed gently over them, holding them in a state of quiet continuation. This understanding shaped how the Slavs viewed death, not as a violent severing, but as a descent into another layer of the same living world. At the heart of this realm lived a presence often imagined in a serpentine, vast and ancient. The serpent was not merely an animal, but a symbol of depth movement and hidden power. It slipped between cracks, coiled beneath roots, and traveled paths no human could follow. Its body mirrored rivers winding to the land, and its shedding skin echoed cycles of death and renewal. To fear entirely would be to misunderstand it. The serpent was chaos, yes, but chaos that made rebirth possible. Water flowed through the lower world like memory itself. Underground springs fed rivers above. Marshes breathed mist into the air. Wells opened dark mouths into unseen depths. These waters were believed to remember everything that passed through them. This is why offerings were often lowered into wells or cast into rivers. Water was a messenger, carrying human intention downward where it could be transformed. The underworld was not separate from daily life. It pressed upward constantly. Illness, sudden misfortune, unexplained dreams, all were signs of the balance between realms that shifted. When something went wrong, people did not immediately blame chance. They listened. They searched for what had been neglected, what boundary had been crossed, what silence had been broken. Certain places were known to be closer to this lower realm than others. Swamps, caves, deep forests where light struggled to reach the ground. These were spaces where the veil thinned. People entered them carefully, speaking softly or not at all. Even footsteps were measured. It was not fear that guided them, but awareness. These places were powerful because they were closer to the roots of the world. Night belonged partly to this realm as well. As the sun set and shadows lengthened, the world leaned downward. Sounds changed. Familiar paths felt different. Dreams became more vivid, more unsettling, more meaningful. Sleep was not just rest. It was a temporary surrender, a drifting closer to the depths. This is why bedtime rituals mattered. Protective words were spoken. Fires were banked carefully. Nothing was left to chance when the boundary between worlds softened. The lower realm also held the ancestors. They were not imagined as distant spirits drifting away, but as presences still tied to land and blood. They watched quietly, offering guidance through intuition and dreams rather than commands. Forgetting them weakened the living. Remembering them strengthened the bond between past and present. This continuity gave life a sense of depth rather than finality. Chaos in this context did not mean disorder without meaning. It meant potential. The underworld was unpredictable because it held the raw forces from which form emerged. Floods could destroy, but they also renewed soil. Death could bring grief, but it also made space for new life. Nothing was static. Everything was in motion, even in darkness. Stories warned against descending too deeply or too carelessly into this realm, not because it was forbidden, but because it demanded respect. Those who sought power without understanding were often lost, not physically, but spiritually. They returned changed, disconnected, unable to find their place along the trunk of the world. These tales were not meant to frighten children into obedience. They were reminders that knowledge carried weight. As new belief systems arrived, the lower realm was slowly reshaped into something far more frightening. Darkness became evil. Depth became punishment. The serpent became an enemy rather than a necessity. In doing so, much of the nuance was lost. What had once been a source of balance became something to deny or destroy. Yet traces of the old understanding remain. In the instinctive unease people feel near deep water at night. In the way caves inspire both curiosity and caution. In the sense that some places feel heavy with memory, even when nothing visible explains why. These are not accidents. They are echoes of a time when the world's depths were acknowledged rather than dismissed. The ancient Slavs lived knowing that beneath every step lay another world, just as real as the one lit by sun and fire. They did not seek to conquer it. They accepted its presence, honored its power, and understood that without the dark below, nothing above could stand. And so the serpent remained coiled and patient, not as a villain, but as a reminder that life is layered, that order depends on chaos. that beneath the surface of all things, something ancient still moves, waiting, shaping, and renewing the world in silence. Between the rumbling sky above and the damp, shadowed depth below, there existed a tension that never truly rested. The ancient Slavs felt in the changing of weather, in the sudden failure of crops, in the uneasy stillness before disaster. This tension was not a single event or battle frozen in time. It was an ongoing struggle woven into the fabric of existence itself. Order and chaos were not enemies to be defeated, but forces locked in a necessary, endless rivalry. The sky and the depths pressed against each other through the human world. Thunder rolled across the heavens, while waters swelled beneath the earth. When storms brought heavy rain, rivers overflowed, blurring the boundary between above and below. These moments were not coincidences. They were seen as signs that the balance between realms was shifting, that the ancient struggle had reached outward into the world of people. This rivalry was not fought with armies or swords, but with movement and resistance. The sky sought to impose structure, clarity, and direction. It brought light, sound, and visible power. The depths responded with concealment, transformation, and patience. Where the sky acted suddenly, the underworld endured. Where lightning struck in an instant, roots grew slowly, reshaping stone over time. Humans lived in the middle of this tension, affected by both sides whether they wished it or not. A good harvest required rain from above, but too much rain awakened destructive waters from below. Stability depended on moderation, on the careful interplay between forces that could never fully overpower one another. Excess in either direction led to suffering. Myths told of pursuits rather than victories. The sky's power chased the serpent of the depths across the world, striking at it with lightning. The serpent evaded, slipping into rivers, caves, and roots beyond reach. Each strike shook the land, each escape reshaped it. Mountains were formed, valleys carved, rivers redirected. The landscape itself became a record of this endless movement. These stories were not told loudly or dramatically. They were shared quietly, as explanation for why the world looked the way it did. A split rock, a twisted tree, a scorched hillside. These were not random features. They were reminders that the struggle continued, unseen but never absent. Fear did not dominate these tales. Acceptance did. People understood that without this tension, the world would stagnate. Complete order would freeze life into rigidity. Complete chaos would dissolve it into nothing. The rivalry maintained motion, growth, and renewal. Conflict, in this sense, was creative. Storms that destroyed also cleansed. Floods that drowned also enriched soil. Fires sparked by lightning cleared forests so new growth could emerge. Loss was never separated from possibility. This understanding softened grief without erasing it. When tragedy struck, it was mourned, but it was also placed within a larger pattern that extended beyond individual suffering. The rivalry shaped human behavior as well. People learned not to challenge either force directly. Arrogance toward the sky invited sudden punishment. Carelessness toward the depths invited slow decay. Wisdom lay in navigating between them, honoring both without surrendering fully to either. Rituals reflected this balance. Offerings were made to the heavens and to the earth. Certain actions were taken at dawn, others at dusk. Fire and water were treated with equal respect. Every gesture acknowledged the presence of opposing forces that had to be kept in harmony. This worldview discouraged absolute thinking. Nothing was entirely good or entirely bad. Power could nurture or destroy depending on context. This created a culture of caution rather than conquest. Survival depended on reading signs, adjusting behavior, and accepting limits. As centuries passed, later belief systems simplified this complexity. Conflict became moralized. One side became righteous, the other evil. The old stories lost their subtlety, their quiet acceptance of contradiction. But beneath these newer interpretations, the ancient rhythm still pulses. Even now, people sense it in moments of instability, when weather turns violent without warning, when systems fail despite careful planning, when life shifts suddenly, pulling the ground out from beneath familiar patterns. These experiences echo the old understanding that balance is fragile and always temporary. The ancient Slavs did not expect resolution. They expected continuation. The rivalry was not meant to end. It was meant to sustain the world through constant movement. Order chased chaos. Chaos tested order. Between them, life unfolded. And so, beneath rolling clouds and above winding roots, the struggle remained, not as a war to be won, but as a rhythm to be endured. A reminder that the world lives because it is never completely at peace, and that even in tension there is meaning. Time, for the ancient Slavs, was not something that slipped away or ran out. It returned, again and again, with quiet certainty. The world did not move forward in a straight line, leaving the past behind. Instead, it turned like a great wheel, carrying familiar moments back into view, changed only slightly by what had come before. This understanding shaped everything, from how people worked the land to how they understood life, death, and the passage of generations. The turning of the seasons was the most visible expression of this rhythm. Winter was not an ending, but a pause. The land slept beneath snow and frost, holding its strength in reserve. Fields lay still, trees bare, rivers slow beneath ice. This silence was not feared. It was expected. It was part of the cycle, a necessary withdrawal before renewal. When spring arrived, it was not celebrated as a sudden miracle, but as a return. The earth softened. Water began to move again. Green broke through brown soil in small, patient gestures. These changes were watched closely, not with surprise, but with recognition. They had happened before. They would happen again. This familiarity brought comfort in a world where little else was predictable. Summer represented fullness rather than excess. It was a season of growth, work, and visible abundance. Days stretched long, filled with labor beneath the sun. Crops matured. Animals grew strong. Life felt open and expansive. But even in this warmth, there was awareness that it would not last. Nothing ever did. This knowledge encouraged gratitude without illusion. Autumn arrived quietly, not as loss, but as transition. Leaves changed color and fell. Harvests were gathered. Fires burned longer in the evenings. The world seemed to exhale. Preparation replaced expansion. What had been grown was stored. What could not be kept was released. This letting go was not mournful. It was practical and deeply understood. The seasons were not governed by distant forces acting without concern. They were the visible outcome of deeper rhythms moving through the world. The rivalry between sky and depths, the flow of water, the warmth of fire, everything converged in the cycle of time. People did not believe they could control these rhythms, but they believed they could align themselves with them. Festivals and rituals marked important moments along this turning wheel. They were not rigid celebrations with fixed meanings. They were reminders, pauses where people acknowledged where they stood in the cycle. Light was welcomed back. Darkness was honored rather than feared. The balance between them was reaffirmed. Life stages mirrored these seasonal movements. Birth aligned with spring. Youth reflected summer's energy. Adulthood carried the responsibility of autumn. Old age echoed winter's stillness and wisdom. Death was not placed outside the cycle. It was another turning, another return. This view softened the fear of endings, placing them within a larger continuity. Time was also carried through sound and repetition. Songs repeated familiar patterns. Stories returned to known themes. Even work followed cycles, planting, tending, harvesting, resting. These repetitions did not feel monotonous. They felt grounding. Each return offered a chance to do things slightly differently, with greater understanding. Night and day reflected the same principle. Darkness did not threaten light. It completed it. Sleep was not a loss of time, but necessary descent into restoration. Dreams were not distractions. They were messages carried from deeper layers of the world, shaped by memory and intuition. This cyclical understanding created patience. People did not expect immediate results. They planted knowing they would wait. They endured winters, trusting spring would come. They accepted hardship with the belief that change was inevitable, even if its shape was unknown. When something disrupted this rhythm, a failed harvest, an unseasonable storm, it caused deep unease. Such events were not seen as random misfortune. They suggested imbalance, a break in the expected turning. The response was not panic, but careful attention. What had been neglected? What sign had been missed? As later cultures introduced linear time, With clear beginnings and endings, much of this perspective faded. History became a march forward rather than a circle. Progress replaced a turn. In doing so, something quietly essential was lost, the reassurance that nothing truly vanished forever. Yet even now, the old rhythm persists beneath modern calendars and clocks. The body still responds to seasons. Rest still follows exertion. Growth still requires patience. No matter how much time is measured, it cannot escape its cyclical nature. The ancient Slavs lived within this understanding, allowing time to carry them rather than fighting its flow. They did not chase the future or cling desperately to the past. They stood within the turning, trusting that what was meant to return would do so. And as night deepens and sleep draws near, this old rhythm feels familiar again. The sense that rest is not an end, but a pause. That darkness is not absence, but preparation. That time, like the world itself, is always quietly turning, waiting to bring something known back into view. While the thunder moved across the sky and the depths stirred beneath the soil, another presence flowed quietly through the Slavic world, steady and enduring. It was found not in sudden flashes of power, but in the slow work of growth, nourishment, and care. The earth itself was not seen as passive ground beneath human feet, but as a living, receptive force, one that listened, remembered, and responded. Within this understanding emerged the figures often described as goddesses, though they were less like rulers and more like sustaining currents running through land and water alike. The soil was sacred because it gave without spectacle. Seeds disappeared into it with no promise of return, yet life emerged reliably, season after season. This quiet generosity shaped how earth-associated deities were understood. They were not distant or demanding. They were present in the weight of grain, in the softness of newly turned ground, in the slow strength of roots pushing through darkness. To care for the earth was not devotion. It was relationship. Water, too, was bound to this nurturing force. Rivers were imagined as feminine not because they were gentle, but because they carried life forward continuously. They carved valleys, fed crops, and connected distant regions. Springs emerged from unseen places, cool and constant, reminding people that sustenance often came from hidden depths. Water was both womb and passage, beginning and transition at once. Rain held particular significance. It fell from the sky, yet belonged to the earth. It bridged realms, touching everything it passed. Gentle rain was welcomed as blessing. Long droughts were mourned as silence. Too much rain brought fear, not because water was harmful, but because even nourishment could overwhelm when balance was lost. This duality was deeply understood and never simplified. Fertility in the Slavic worldview extended beyond childbirth. It included the fertility of land, animals, ideas, and communities. A fertile year meant not only full granaries, but healthy herds, strong families, and stable bonds between people. When fertility waned, it was felt everywhere. The response was collective rather than individual. Rituals were shared. Responsibility was shared. Balance was restored together, or not at all. Women were often seen as closer to these forces, not by hierarchy, but by resonance. Their bodies mirrored the cycles of the land. Their roles in tending homes, gardens, and food stores aligned them naturally with earth rhythms. This did not elevate or diminish them. It rooted them within the same living patterns that governed everything else. Men, too, participated in these cycles, but the association with nurturing continuity gave feminine figures a distinct presence in myth and ritual. Water spirits and earth mothers were not imagined as endlessly kind. They could withdraw. They could withhold. Barren fields, dry wells, and repeated loss were signs that something had gone wrong. But punishment was rarely the assumed cause. More often it was neglect, a forgotten ritual, a broken bond, a loss of attentiveness. The solution was not force, but restoration. Rivers were treated with particular respect because they could not be controlled easily. Bridges were built carefully. Crossings were marked. Offerings were sometimes made before journeys, not as payment, but as acknowledgement. To cross water was to enter uncertainty. Many myths place moments of transformation near rivers for this reason. What entered the water was rarely the same when it emerged. Wells held an even deeper quiet. They reached down into darkness, bringing life upward. Looking into a well was like looking into another world. People spoke softly near them. Children were warned not to shout or throw stones carelessly. Wells were not dangerous because they were deep, but because they connected realms that were not meant to be disturbed without reason. The goddesses associated with these elements were not uniform across Slavic lands. Names shifted. Attributes overlapped. In some places, the earth was imagined as a mother figure with broad, patient presence. In others, water spirits took precedence, flowing and elusive. This variation was not confusion. It was adaptation. The land shaped belief as much as belief shaped understanding. Birth was one of the most powerful moments where these forces were felt. It was not viewed purely as a human event, but as something assisted by unseen hands. Protective rituals surrounded childbirth, acknowledging vulnerability and strength intertwined. New life was welcomed not only by family, but by the world itself. Similarly, planting carried echoes of birth. Seeds were handled with care, pressed into the soil gently. There was trust involved. Once placed, the seed was beyond human reach. It belonged to the earth. Waiting followed. This waiting taught patience more effectively than instruction ever could. As time passed and new belief systems reshaped spiritual landscapes, these nurturing forces were often softened, simplified, or absorbed into new figures. Earth goddesses became saints. Water spirits became folklore. Fertility rituals became seasonal customs stripped of explanation. But the practices remained because they worked. They aligned people with cycles that could not be erased. Even now, people feel calmer near water. Gardens soothe the mind. Touching soil grounds attention. These responses are not learned. They are remembered. The ancient Slavs lived with this awareness constantly, not as philosophy, but as daily experience. To them, the world did not survive on power alone. It survived on care, on repetition, on quiet forces that did not announce themselves loudly, but never stopped working. The goddesses of earth and water were not symbols of softness. They were symbols of endurance. And as night settles and thoughts slow, this gentler rhythm becomes easier to sense. The steady presence beneath all movement, the quiet assurance that life continues, growing patiently in darkness, waiting for its moment to rise again. As the sun sank and the outer world grew quiet, the center of life for the ancient Slavs shifted inward, toward the warm glow of the hearth. Fire was not merely a tool for cooking or warmth. It was a living heart of the home, a presence that demanded care, respect, and constant attention. Within its flickering light, the boundaries between the everyday and the sacred softened, and the home itself became a protected space within an unpredictable world. The hearth fire was rarely allowed to die completely. Even embers were guarded, banked carefully beneath ash, ready to be stirred back into flame. Letting the fire go out without intention was considered a sign of neglect, not just of the home, but the unseen forces that watched over it. Fire connected generations. A flame kindled from another household carried familiarity and trust. In this way, warmth was shared not only physically, but spiritually. Fire was believed to watch and remember. Words spoken near the hearth mattered. Arguments were avoided in its presence. Promises made by its light carried weight. It was thought that the fire absorbed the emotions of those gathered around it, storing harmony or discord within its glow. For this reason, evenings were often calm, deliberate, and reflective. The home itself was not an empty structure. It was inhabited by protective spirits who ensured balance and safety when treated with respect. These unseen guardians were not dramatic or frightening. They were quiet, practical, and deeply connected to daily routines. Their presence was felt more than seen, acknowledged through small gestures rather than grand rituals. Simple habits carried meaning. Food was not thrown into the fire carelessly. Certain items were placed near the hearth deliberately. Before long journeys, people paused by the fire, standing in its warmth as if asking permission to leave. Upon returning, they greeted it again, grounding themselves back into the safety of home. The hearth was also where stories lived. After the day's work was done and darkness settled outside, voices softened and tales emerged. These were not performances. They were offerings of memory and meaning, passed from one generation to the next. Children learned the shape of the world in firelight, absorbing lessons without realizing they were being taught. Fire marked the passage of time within the household. Births were celebrated near it. Deaths were mourned beside it. The fire witnessed every stage of life, steady while people came and went. This continuity gave comfort. No matter how the world changed outside, the hearth remained. Ashes were treated with care as well. They were not waste, but remnants of warmth and protection. Spread in fields, they were believed to carry the home's strength outward, blessing crops and land. Even what remained after the fire had burned carried meaning. In the long winters, the hearth became the center of existence. Snow pressed against walls. Wind howled outside. Inside, fire held darkness at bay. Its sound was soothing, rhythmic, alive. Watching flames dance created a sense of calm that slowed thoughts and softened fears. Sleep came easier when the fire burned steadily. Fire's dual nature was never forgotten. It warmed, but it could also destroy. Carelessness invited disaster. This awareness encouraged attentiveness. Children were taught early not to treat fire as a toy. Respect was not fear. It was understanding of power held close. As communities grew and beliefs evolved, the sacred role of the hearth remained surprisingly resilient. Even as temples replaced groves and new rituals took shape, the home fire continued to carry quiet significance. It was personal in a way larger religious spaces could never be. Over time, some of these meanings faded, replaced by convenience and technology. Fire became controlled, hidden behind metal and stone. Yet the instinct remains. People still gather around warmth, still lower their voices near flame, still feel comfort in its presence. The ancient Slavs understood that while gods ruled skies and depths, daily life required a gentler guardian. The hearth provided this. It did not demand sacrifice or fear. It asked only for care, attention, and respect. And as night deepens and sleep approaches, the memory of that warmth lingers. A quiet center, a steady glow, a reminder that even in a vast, unpredictable world, there was always a place where light endured, watching softly, waiting through the dark. Beyond the edges of the fields and past the last familiar paths, the forest began. For the ancient Slavs, this was not an empty wilderness, nor a place to be conquered. It was a living presence, dense with memory, movement, and unseen eyes. Trees did not simply stand. They watched. Paths shifted subtly over time. Sounds carried strangely beneath the canopy, as if the forest itself decided what should be heard and what should remain hidden. Entering the woods required a different way of being. Voices were lowered. Steps slowed. People paid attention not just to where they were going, but to how they moved. The forest did not respond well to carelessness. This belief was not born from superstition alone, but from experience. A wrong turn could lead to days of wandering. A careless act could invite injury, or worse. Over time, these practical dangers became intertwined with spiritual understanding. Forest spirits were not imagined as singular beings waiting to frighten travelers. They were many, subtle, and deeply tied to place. Some guarded clearings. Others lingered near old trees or crossroads. Their presence was felt as a shift in air, a sudden quiet, or the sense of being watched without seeing anything at all. These sensations were not dismissed. They were warnings or sometimes invitations, depending on how one responded. Respect was a guiding principle. People did not shout or break branches unnecessarily. Offerings were small and simple, a piece of bread, a coin, a whispered word of thanks. These gestures were not bribes. They were acknowledgments that humans were guests in a space that did not belong to them. The forest was also a source of survival. Wood for shelter and fire, herbs for healing, animals for food, all came from beneath its canopy. This created a relationship of dependence balanced by restraint. Taking too much or taking without care risked angering not just spirits, but the forest itself. Illness, poor hunting, or disorientation were seen as consequences of imbalance rather than punishment. Children were taught early that the forest listened. Stories warned of those who mocked it, who ignored signs, who treated it as something lesser. Such figures often disappeared or returned changed, quieter, more cautious. These tales were not meant to terrify, but to instill awareness. The forest rewarded attentiveness. Night transformed the woods entirely. Familiar shapes dissolved into shadow. Sounds multiplied, then vanished. The boundary between imagination and reality thinned. Fires were rarely lit deep within the forest after dark. As light attracted attention, silence became protection. Travelers who had to move at night relied on instinct and memory rather than sight. Yet the forest was not only a place of danger, it was also a place of refuge. Those fleeing conflict or hardship often sought its shelter. The same complexity that made it unpredictable also made it difficult to pursue someone within its depths. The forest could hide, mislead, and protect when needed. Certain trees were regarded as especially powerful. Old, twisted trunks, scarred by lightning or time, were approached with care. People sensed that these trees had witnessed countless seasons and events. Standing near them inspired quiet reflection. Some believed such trees acted as bridges between realms, their roots and branches connecting what was seen and unseen. Animals were considered part of the forest's voice. Their behavior was watched closely. Sudden silence among birds, unusual movement among animals. These were signs worth heeding. The forest communicated constantly, but not in words. Understanding it required patience and humility. As beliefs changed and forests were cleared, much of this relationship faded. Trees became resources rather than presences. Paths became roads. Silence became emptiness. But even now, stepping into deep woods can awaken a familiar feeling, a heightened awareness, a subtle tension, a sense of entering a space that operates by different rules. The ancient Slavs did not romanticize the forest. They respected it. They knew it could nourish or destroy, shelter or deceive. This understanding allowed them to coexist with it rather than attempt to dominate it. And as the sounds of the night soften and thoughts drift, the image of the forest lingers. A vast, breathing world just beyond the firelight. Quiet, watchful, and still alive with stories for those willing to listen carefully. Water moved through the Slavic world with a patience that felt almost deliberate. It did not hurry, yet it never truly stopped. Rivers curved across the land like long memories, passing through forests, fields, and settlements without belonging to any of them. To live near water was to live beside something older than human presence, something that seen countless lives come and go without changing its essential nature. Rivers were not merely boundaries or resources. They were living pathways, carrying stories from distant places. What happened upstream would eventually arrive downstream, transformed but connected. This made water a symbol of consequence. Actions taken in one place could affect another far away, unseen until much later. This understanding encouraged restraint and foresight, values deeply embedded in Slavic thought. Lakes held a different kind of power. Still on the surface, they reflected the sky perfectly, creating the illusion of another world just beneath the waterline. People believed lakes had depths that did not correspond to their visible size. A small lake could be bottomless. A calm surface could conceal powerful currents below. This uncertainty made lakes both mesmerizing and unsettling. Many stories spoke of beings who lived within these waters, not as monsters, but as guardians or embodiments of the water's will. These beings were rarely described in detail. Their forms shifted like reflections, sometimes appearing human, sometimes not. What mattered was not how they looked, but how they behaved. They rewarded respect and punished carelessness, not out of malice, but out of balance. Drowning was one of the most feared deaths, not because of pain alone, but because of its symbolic weight. To be taken by water meant crossing into another realm without preparation. Such deaths were treated with caution and sorrow. Rituals surrounding water-related loss reflected a belief that the boundary between worlds had been crossed too abruptly, leaving something unresolved. Bridges were therefore places of significance. They connected lands separated by water, allowing safe passage over a powerful threshold. Crossing a bridge was never entirely casual. People paused, adjusted their behavior, sometimes spoke protective words. Bridges were meeting points between stability and flow, order and uncertainty. Rain, too, carried memory. Falling from the sky, it joined rivers, fed lakes, soaked soil. Every drop connected heaven and earth, passing through multiple realms in a single descent. Long rains were listened to carefully. The sound of water against roofs and leaves became a kind of language, telling stories of abundance or warning of excess. Water was also tied closely to healing and purification. Bathing was not just physical cleansing, but spiritual renewal. Streams were chosen carefully for such acts, preferably those untouched by heavy use. Entering water required intention. Leaving it marked a subtle change, as if something unseen had been washed away. Wells represented the most intimate relationship with water. Dug into the earth, they reached down into darkness to bring life upward. Looking into a well was like peering into another layer of the world. People spoke softly near them. Dropping objects carelessly into a well was discouraged, not only because it could contaminate the water, but because it showed disrespect to what lay below. Night transformed water further. Reflections disappeared. Sounds carried farther. A river at night felt like a moving shadow, its presence sensed more than seen. Many avoided water after dark unless necessary, not because it was forbidden, but because the boundary between worlds was believed to thin, and water was a known passage. Stories told of voices heard near rivers at night, calling softly, indistinctly. These were not always meant to deceive. Sometimes they were warnings. Sometimes they were echoes of past lives. Listening too closely, however, risked being drawn in. Curiosity without caution was a recurring theme in such tales. Seasonal changes reshaped water's character. Spring floods were powerful and dangerous, yet they brought renewal. Rivers swelled, spilling into fields, leaving behind fertile soil once they receded. This destructive generosity was understood as part of water's nature. Try and prevent it entirely would invite worse consequences later. In winter, frozen rivers became silent roads. People walked across surfaces that had flowed freely only weeks before. This temporary stillness was deceptive. Ice could crack without warning, reminding everyone that water's power never truly slept. Even frozen, it demanded respect. As time passed and modern explanations replaced older beliefs, water lost much of its voice. It became something measured, controlled, redirected, yet the emotional response remains. Standing near water still quiets the mind. Watching it flow encourages reflection. Hearing rain at night invites rest. The ancient Slavs lived with water as a constant companion. They listened to it, feared it, trusted it, and honored it. They understood that water remembered, that it carried the past forward, shaping the future quietly, persistently. And as the sound of flowing water settles in the background of thought, it becomes easier to let the mind drift, like a river moving steadily through darkness, carrying fragments of memory, smoothing rough edges, guiding everything gently toward rest. As daylight faded and the last colors drained from the sky, the world the ancient Slavs knew did not simply grow darker. It changed character. Sounds softened, distances blurred, and familiar places became uncertain. Night was not an absence of life, but a shift in its expression. It was a time when the boundaries between what was seen and what was sensed grew thin, when the world leaned closer to the unseen layers beneath and above ordinary waking life. Darkness carried a presence of its own. It was not automatically feared, but it demanded caution. People moved more slowly at night, spoke more quietly, and paid attention to signs they might ignore during the day. Shadows seemed deeper, silence more deliberate. Even the air felt heavier, as if filled with listening. Night was believed to belong partly to beings who did not walk freely in daylight. These were not creatures of spectacle or horror, but subtle presences that move along the edges of perception. They appeared in half-remembered dreams, in the feeling of being watched, in the sudden chill that passed through a room without explanation. To name them too clearly was considered unwise. What mattered was acknowledging their existence, not defining it. Sleep itself was seen as a vulnerable state. When the body rested, the spirit wandered. Dreams were not dismissed as random images, but treated as messages, warnings, or glimpses into other layers of reality. Not every dream held meaning, but none were entirely empty. Even confusion could be a sign that something deeper was stirring. Before sleep, small rituals helped protect the dreamer. Fires were banked carefully so their glow would last through the night. Words were spoken softly. Sometimes not words at all, but familiar sounds repeated for comfort. Certain objects were placed nearby, not as talismans of power, but as anchors to the waking world. Children were especially guarded at night. Their dreams were believed to be more open, more easily influenced. Stories told before sleep were chosen carefully, meant to calm rather than excite. Sudden awakenings were soothed gently, without scolding, because it was understood that something unseen might have startled them. Night spirits were not inherently malicious. Many were thought to wander without intention, drawn by warmth, emotion, or imbalance. Homes that were calm and orderly attracted little attention. Disorder allowed conflict, or careless words invited curiosity. This belief encouraged harmony not through fear, but through awareness. The moments just before sleep were considered especially important. Thoughts lingered, emotions settled. What one carried into sleep could shape dreams, and dreams could shape waking life. This made nighttime reflection a quiet discipline. Regrets were set aside. Gratitude was encouraged. Lingering anger was seen as dangerous, not morally, but spiritually. Dreams of water often carried messages of change. Dreams of fire suggested transformation or warning. Dreams of forest spoke of uncertainty or guidance. These interpretations were not rigid. Context mattered. The dreamer's life mattered. Meaning was personal, shaped by experience rather than fixed rules. Some dreams were believed to be shared, especially during certain times of year, when the veil between worlds grew thinner. People reported seeing similar images, feeling similar unease or comfort. These shared dreams reinforce a belief that sleep connected individuals to something larger than themselves. Nightmares were treated with care. They were not dismissed as imagination, nor were they exaggerated into prophecy. A frightening dream suggested imbalance, exhaustion, or neglected attention. The response was gentle correction, rest, reflection, small offerings, changes in routine. Fear was acknowledged but not indulged. The deep hours of night, when even animals fell silent, were thought to belong most strongly to the unseen. This was not a time to wander aimlessly. Those who did risked becoming disoriented, not just physically, but inwardly. Losing one's way at night carried symbolic weight, a reminder that without light, orientation required more than sight. Moonlight softened darkness without banishing it. The moon was not trusted completely, but it was respected. It illuminated enough to move carefully, to recognize shapes, but left much hidden. This partial clarity mirrored the nature of night itself, revealing just enough, withholding the rest. Illness was believed to deepen at night, while healing also began there. The body's vulnerability mirrored the world's openness. Rest was therefore sacred. Interrupting it unnecessarily disrupted natural processes. Even tending the sick was done quietly, with minimal disturbance. As belief systems changed and artificial light pushed back darkness, much of this understanding faded. Night became something to defeat, to fill with activity and noise. Sleep was shortened. Dreams were ignored. Yet the body resisted. Fatigue returned. Rest demanded recognition. Even now, certain nights feel heavier than others. Certain dreams linger long after waking. Certain silences feel charged. These sensations are echoes of an older relationship with darkness, one that acknowledged its power without surrendering to fear. The ancient Slavs did not rush through night. They allowed it to unfold. They trusted that morning would return, as it always had. In the meantime, they rested within uncertainty, guarded by quiet rituals and shared understanding. And as sleep deepens, thought slow, and the world softens, that ancient wisdom feels close again. The sense that night is not empty, but alive. That dreams are not meaningless, but messages shaped by memory and instinct. That rest itself is a journey, gentle, mysterious, and necessary. Death, to the ancient Slavs, was never a sudden fall into nothingness. It was a movement, slow and inevitable, like the setting of the sun or the quiet arrival of winter. Life did not end. It shifted direction. The breath left the body, but the presence of the person did not vanish. It traveled inward, downward, and onward into another layer of the same living world that had always surrounded the living. The moment of death was treated with stillness and respect. Loud grief was restrained, not because sorrow was forbidden, but because the passage itself was delicate. The spirit needed calm to find its way. Sudden cries or chaos could confuse it, anchoring it too closely to the world it was leaving. Silence created a path. The body was prepared carefully. Washing was done with intention, not haste. Each gesture acknowledged that the person had not become something else entirely. They were still connected, still present in a quieter way. Objects placed with the body were not treasures meant to display wealth, but familiar items, tools, tokens, small comforts that carried memory. Burial places were chosen thoughtfully. The dead were returned to land, often close to where they had lived. Separation between the living and the dead was minimal. Ancestors remained part of the community, not as haunting figures, but as steady witnesses. Their presence strengthened continuity between generations. The afterlife was not imagined as a distant paradise or a place of punishment. It was an extension of the world, deeper and quieter, a place where life slowed, where memories settled, where individuals became part of a broader flow. The dead did not cease to exist. They changed their way of being. Fate was understood not as a rigid script, but as a weaving of actions, choices, and inherited momentum. What one did in life shaped not only personal destiny, but the balance of community and the land. Death did not erase these threads. It gathered them, tying them into the larger pattern. There was little emphasis on judgment after death. Life itself was the test. Balance was measured through relationships, care for land, and respect for unseen forces. Those who lived attentively were believed to move more easily into the next state. Those who lived carelessly carried restlessness with them. The dead were not expected to interfere constantly with the living. Most remained quiet, present through memory rather than action. However, when proper rites were neglected, unease followed. Dreams became troubled. Livestock behaved strangely. These signs were interpreted not as punishment, but as reminders that attention was needed. Annual remembrance held great importance. Certain times of year were reserved for honoring those who had passed. Food was shared. Fires burned. Silence was observed. These acts reaffirmed connection rather than mourning loss. The dead were invited to remain part of the cycle, acknowledged without fear. Children grew up knowing the names of ancestors. Stories were told not as distant history, but as living influence. This familiarity softened fear. Death was known, not hidden. It was spoken of carefully, but openly, as something everyone would eventually experience. Illness and aging were approached with patience. The slowing of the body was not resisted aggressively. It was accepted as part of the turning cycle. Elders were valued not despite their closeness to death, but because of it. They stood nearest the threshold and carried insight from that position. Grief was allowed, but it was not isolating. Communities shared the weight. No one mourned alone. The belief that the dead remained connected reduced the finality of loss. Absence was felt, but presence lingered in subtler forms. Dreams often served as bridges between the living and the dead. An ancestor appearing in sleep was not always a message. Sometimes it was simply a reminder of connection. Such dreams were not clung to desperately nor dismissed. They were received calmly, integrated gently. As new religions arrived, ideas of heaven, hell, and judgment reshaped these beliefs. Death became a destination rather than a transition. Fear replaced familiarity. But beneath these changes, older instincts persisted. People continued to speak softly of the dead. Graves remained places of quiet respect rather than dread. Even now, many feel a strange calm near old burial grounds, a sense of continuity rather than emptiness. This feeling echoes the ancient understanding that the dead are not gone. They are simply elsewhere, still part of the world's deeper rhythm. The ancient Slavs did not seek immortality. They sought belonging. To live well was to take one's place in the cycle fully, knowing that death would carry that place forward rather than erase it. And as thoughts drift toward rest, this understanding offers comfort, that endings are not voids, that those who came before remain woven into the world, that when the time comes, the path forward will be quiet, familiar, and gently guided by the same rhythms that have always shaped life. Among the quiet rhythms of gods, spirits, and seasons, there are always humans who step beyond the ordinary paths. Not heroes in the sense of conquerors or kings, but wanderers, listeners, and those who found themselves standing at the edge of the known world. In Slavic stories, mortals did not dominate myths. They brushed against them. Their encounters with the divine were rarely triumphant and never simple. They were moments of humility, confusion, and transformation. These figures were often ordinary people at the beginning. A farmer following a path he had walked 100 times before. A hunter tracking familiar signs through the forest. A traveler seeking shelter before nightfall. What changed everything was not destiny announced in advance, but a quiet deviation, a wrong turn, a delay, a decision made without understanding its full weight. The sacred did not reveal itself to those who sought it loudly. It emerged for those who stumbled into it unknowingly. When a mortal encountered a god or powerful spirit, the moment was rarely dramatic. There were no grand proclamations or displays of overwhelming power. More often, there was subtlety. A stranger met at a crossroads who spoke too carefully. A woman by a river whose reflection did not behave as it should. A voice heard in the forest when no one was visible. Recognition came slowly, often too late. These encounters tested character rather than strength. Politeness mattered. Humility mattered. The ability to listen mattered most of all. Those who acted with arrogance or impatience rarely fared well. Those who treated the unknown with respect, even without understanding it, were sometimes guided safely back to familiar ground. Many stories describe mortals being offered help without realizing the cost. A favor granted, a shortcut shown, a wish fulfilled in an unexpected way. The gods were not cruel in these exchanges, but they were exact. Nothing was given freely without consequence. Every gift altered balance, and balance demanded response. Time behaved strangely during such encounters. A mortal might spend what felt like hours in the presence of a god, only to return and find years had passed. Or they might believe they had been gone for days when only moments had elapsed. This distortion was not punishment. It was a reminder that divine rhythms did not align with human ones. Returning from such encounters was often harder than entering them. The world felt quieter, flatter, less alive. Some wanderers struggled to resume ordinary life. They carried knowledge they could not fully explain, or longing for something they could not name. These individuals did not become leaders or prophets. They became quiet figures, changed inwardly, often misunderstood. Not all encounters ended gently. Some mortals crossed boundaries unknowingly. They spoke forbidden names. They mocked what should have been respected. These stories ended in loss. Not always death, but disorientation, isolation, or disappearance. The lesson was not obedience, but awareness. The world was layered, and moving through it required care. Heroes, when they appeared, were not invincible. They succeeded through endurance rather than dominance. They listened to warnings. They accepted help. Their strength lay in adaptability. Victory often came at a cost, leaving them diminished or altered rather than celebrated. Wanderers occupied a special place in these tales. Travel itself was a liminal state, neither here nor there. Those who moved between villages encountered more of the unseen world simply because they lived closer to its thresholds. Roads, bridges, forests, and rivers were not just locations, but points of transition where encounters were more likely. The gods did not seek worship from mortals in these stories. They sought recognition, to be acknowledged as part of the same world, operating on different terms. Mortals who understood this did not beg or boast. They listened, responded carefully, and accepted outcomes without resentment. Women and men appeared equally in these narratives, though their experiences differed. Women often encountered divine forces tied to land, water, and fate. Men more often met storm, forest, or road-bound powers. These patterns reflected daily life rather than hierarchy. Each carried its own risks and revelations. Some mortals were chosen repeatedly, not because they were special, but because they remained attentive. They noticed patterns others ignored. They remembered warnings. Their continued encounters shaped them slowly, like water shaping stone. As belief systems changed, these stories were reshaped. God became demons or saints. Wanderers became sinners or fools. The subtlety of the original tales faded, replaced by moral certainty. Yet the core remained. Humans are small within a vast, living world, and survival depends on how carefully one listens. Even now, these stories resonate. The feeling of being watched in certain places. The sense that a decision made casually carries unseen weight. the experience of returning from somewhere changed, unable to explain why. The ancient Slavs did not tell these stories to glorify danger. They told them to teach navigation, how to move through a world alive with forces beyond comprehension. The mortal figures were not meant to be admired, but recognized. They were reflections of anyone who stepped outside familiarity and found themselves momentarily touching something vast. And as the mind slows and thoughts drift, these quiet encounters linger, not as tales of conquest, but as reminders that the world listens, that humility opens paths, that wandering, when done attentively, can reveal more than certainty ever could. Magic in the ancient Slavic world was not the flashy spectacle of flames and lightning often depicted in modern stories. It was subtle, woven into the rhythms of daily life, and understood as a practical extension of knowledge rather than a separate, fantastical domain. People did not perform rituals for entertainment. They acted with intent, guided by centuries of observation, memory, and careful attention to the unseen. Magic was a language, quiet but powerful, and those who learned it well could influence the currents of life without ever raising their voices. Herbs were among the most tangible tools of this magic. Leaves, roots, and flowers were gathered with intention, each chosen for its particular properties. Some healed wounds, others eased fevers, and some were used to attract favorable forces or repel danger. Gathering herbs required timing as much as technique. Certain plants had to be picked at dawn, or on a specific day of the week, or during particular phases of the moon. Doing so without care was thought to reduce their effectiveness or even invite harm. The act itself was an acknowledgement that the world was alive and responsive, and that every choice had weight. Words were equally potent. Spells were not long incantations with complicated gestures. They were simple phrases, repeated thoughtfully, often whispered to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. The tone mattered as much as the meaning. Speaking too loudly could scatter the effect, while words spoken with impatience or doubt might twist outcomes in unexpected ways. Some phrases were passed down in families, others discovered through careful observation and trial. Knowledge was valued over spectacle, understanding over bravado. Objects, too, held power when properly charged and positioned. Stones placed at crossroads, water drawn from a sacred spring, or bread left by a threshold could serve as protective anchors. These items were rarely elaborate. Their potency lay in intention and awareness, in the subtle way the human mind and the unseen world were believed to intersect. Ordinary objects handled without care could become conduits for energy, but ordinary handling without mindfulness risked nullifying or misdirecting that force. The knowledge of magic was closely tied to life and survival. Healing was a central concern. Injuries, illness, and sudden misfortune demanded more than physical remedies. They required spiritual alignment as well. A wound might be cleansed with water, dressed with herbs, and accompanied by a carefully spoken phrase. Each step reinforced the balance between the physical and the unseen. When successful, it was a quiet affirmation that attention and understanding could influence forces beyond the ordinary. Protection was another major concern. Homes, livestock, and children were guarded with charms and rituals. Crossroads were places of particular vulnerability, where multiple paths converged and unseen currents intersected. Travelers would place stones, sprinkle water, or recite brief phrases before passing through. These acts were subtle, designed to ensure safe passage without attracting unnecessary notice. Magic was not about showing strength. It was about minimizing risk and maintaining balance. Fortune, too, was influenced by these practices. Crop success, hunting, and even social relations were thought to respond to careful ritual and respectful attention to spirits. Offerings to water, forest, or hearth spirits could encourage abundance. Ignoring the unseen was understood to invite imbalance. Magic was a means of cooperation rather than coercion. Humans did not control nature or the divine. They aligned with it, nudged it, and prepared themselves for its responses. Witches and wise people held special roles within communities. Their knowledge was practical rather than theatrical. They were consulted quietly, often for guidance on illness, marriage, harvests, or travel. Fear of their power existed, but it was tempered by respect. Misuse of magic was more dangerous to the practitioner than others, because imbalance could rebound unpredictably. The careful observer understood this, and the skillful practitioner acted cautiously, always aware that the unseen world demanded attention rather than obedience. Certain times were considered more favorable for magical work. Night, when the veil between worlds was thin, was one such moment. Dawn, with its quiet energy and changing light, was another. Seasonal shifts, particularly around solstices and equinoxes, were times when ritual actions were believed to carry added potency. These temporal patterns were not arbitrary. They reflected observations of nature and cycles, woven into practical wisdom that guided life. Symbols and gestures were often embedded in daily actions. A sweeping motion, a line drawn in earth, a knot tied in a cord. These were not mere decoration. They encoded intention and focused attention. The physical act reinforced the mental and spiritual, creating a small but meaningful interaction with unseen forces. Magic in this sense was never flashy, but always present, quietly threading through life. Respect for balance was a recurring principle. Overreach, arrogance, or impatience was dangerous. Attempting to force outcomes without understanding could disrupt equilibrium. Many tales warn of those who sought shortcuts, who ignored caution, or who treated magic as a tool for vanity. Their failures reinforced a simple lesson. The unseen world was alive, and human action was significant but limited. Magic also intersected with daily labor. Planting, tending animals, preparing meals, and weaving cloth could all be imbued with intention. Words, gestures, and placement mattered. This was not superstition. It was a way of ensuring mindfulness, a means of interacting meaningfully with the rhythms of life that shape survival. The line between practical action and magical action was often invisible. Even modest households practiced these principles. Every home had a corner for offerings, a vessel of water treated carefully, and knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Magic was ordinary in this way, woven into routine, inseparable from the pattern of life, unremarkable in its presence, yet profoundly influential. Over time, as belief systems shifted, these practices were often marginalized or reinterpreted. What was once practical knowledge became superstition. Witches were feared more than respected. The subtle rhythms were replaced by rigid structures. Yet the echoes remain in folk customs, sayings, and inherited habits. The careful placement of salt, the timing of planting, the whispered words before a journey. These are remnants of a world in which magic was quietly, effectively, and continuously alive. For the ancient Slavs, magic was never spectacle. It was attentiveness. It was patience. It was respect for the living world in all its visible and invisible complexity. To practice it effectively required humility and understanding, not force or pride. The line between ordinary life and magical life was thin because they were understood as one. And as the mind begins to slow, resting in the quiet hours, this awareness returns gently. The unseen does not demand, but observes. Careful attention shapes outcomes subtly, as wind shapes branches and water shapes stone. Magic is not loud. It is patient, quiet, and woven into every breath, every gesture, every moment of living attentively within a world that listens. Life among the ancient Slavs was measured not only by the passage of days or the turning of seasons, but by the sacred markers that punctuated time, moments when the human world intersected intentionally with the unseen. Festivals and communal gatherings were not merely celebrations. They were deliberate acknowledgments of cycles, of balance, and of the invisible forces that govern both growth and decay. The turning of the year, carefully observed, was a mirror of the world's inner rhythms, and participating in these cycles created a sense of continuity and security within a world that was otherwise unpredictable. The year was imagined as a living wheel, and the festivals as the spokes around which life revolved. Each season brought its own rituals, its own meanings, and its own moments of attentive pause. Winter, often the harshest and most unforgiving season, was treated with particular care. Fires burned for warmth and protection, and small offerings were made to spirits who were believed to govern survival during the long nights. The cold and darkness were understood as a pause in the cycle, a time for reflection rather than action, and the festivals of this period honored the endurance of life itself. Candles, fires, and careful ritual gestures acted as beacons, reminders that even in the most challenging months, the world was watched and protection persisted. Spring was a season of awakening, of movement returning to land and water. Festivals celebrated growth and fertility, acknowledging that life could flourish only with proper care and attention. Offerings to rivers, forests, and fields were made to ensure abundance, but they were not mere formalities. Each act carried intention, shaping the human relationship with the cycles of nature. The planting of seeds, the first clearing of fields, the gentle coaxing of young shoots, all were performed in harmony with these seasonal observances. Spring festivals encouraged patience and attentiveness, emphasizing that the outcome of labor depended not solely on effort, but on alignment with unseen forces that guided growth. Summer, long and luminous, brought abundance and energy. The festivals of this season were gatherings of both celebration and vigilance. While work continued in fields and forests, communal observances acknowledged the ongoing presence of protective spirits. Meals shared under open skies, songs lifted around fires, and dances around the clearing were more than entertainment. They reinforced social bonds and reminded participants of the delicate balance between prosperity and overreach. Summer was a time when both the generosity and the volatility of the natural world were most apparent. A sudden storm could ruin crops, and the presence of spirits was invoked to maintain protection. Through these practices, the cycles of life and the cycles of ritual were intertwined, inseparable. Autumn marked a period of harvest and preparation. The culmination of months of labor required gratitude, careful attention, and the recognition that abundance was never guaranteed. Festivals in this season honored the fruits of the earth, the labor of hands, and the continuity of life into colder months. They also acknowledged what had been lost or what would be left behind. Offerings were made to ensure that even what was no longer needed would not invite imbalance. Autumn festivals emphasized reflection, humility, and the careful negotiation of endings. They were a reminder that the cycle of life required both appreciation and foresight, that each transition carried significance. The rituals of these festivals were often multisensory, engaging sight, sound, and touch in ways that strengthened memory and awareness. Fires were lit and tended with care, their smoke carrying prayers to the unseen. Music, simple and repetitive, synchronized with the movements of labor or dance, creating rhythm that reinforced communal cohesion. Food was prepared deliberately, often using methods or ingredients that connected participants with the land and its offerings. Each act, each gesture, each sound carried intentionality. They were subtle forms of interaction with the hidden currents of the world. Certain elements were particularly significant in these celebrations. Water was invited into rituals as a symbol of life, purification, and connection to deeper realms. Rivers and wells were approached with care, and small offerings were left to honor the forces that govern fertility and flow. Fire, already central in daily life, became a more sacred presence during festivals, its flames reflecting both protection and transformation. Earth itself was celebrated. Through the harvest, the preparation of fields for the next cycle, and the careful tending of boundaries between cultivated and wild lands. Communal participation reinforced the interconnectedness of human and unseen worlds. Festivals were not only about individual observance. They were occasions for a collective acknowledgement of the cycles that shaped existence. They encouraged cooperation, reinforced social norms, and created a sense of shared responsibility. By observing these rhythms together, communities strengthened the bonds that allowed them to survive through harsh seasons, unpredictable weather, and other challenges that the natural world imposed. These observances were also educational. Children grew up understanding the cycles of nature, the rhythms of labor, and the presence of unseen forces through participation rather than instruction. They watched elders perform rituals, learned the timing of offerings, and absorbed the significance of each gesture. This passing down of knowledge ensured continuity, preserving both practical wisdom and spiritual awareness. Night held special significance during these festivals. Darkness was not empty. It was alive with potential and caution. Nighttime gatherings emphasized reflection and attentiveness. The interplay of shadow and firelight encouraged focus and mindfulness, reinforcing the lessons of the festival in a form that could be experienced physically and emotionally. The night acted as a mirror, reflecting the unseen forces that govern both life and ritual. Even as new religious systems arrived, these practices adapted rather than disappearing entirely. Certain festivals were absorbed into emerging traditions, retaining the rhythm, timing, and communal aspects while changing outward forms. Despite these shifts, the underlying principle endured. Human life is interwoven with the cycles of nature and unseen forces, and observing these cycles is necessary for balance, well-being, and continuity. Through this lens, the Slavic festivals were not celebrations for celebration's sake. They were practical, spiritual, and deeply intertwined with everyday life. Each ritual, each offering, each song or dance was an acknowledgement of dependency, respect, and alignment with the patterns that sustain both people and the land. They create a framework for understanding change, guiding action, and maintaining equilibrium in a world that was alive, unpredictable, and interconnected. As the seasons turned, the festivals reminded participants that life was a series of transitions, each requiring attention and awareness. The rhythms of planting, growth, harvest, and rest were mirrored in ritual practice. Through these observances, humans learned patience, humility, and the subtlety of cause and effect. They understood that their actions mattered, but that success depended equally on alignment with forces they could not fully control. Even in the quietest moments, the presence of these cycles was felt. The sound of a river after rain, the smell of freshly turned earth, the warmth of fire at night, all echoed the patterns embedded in festival practice. They reinforced the knowledge that the world was alive, that the unseen had influence, and that attentive living maintained harmony. By participating in these rhythms, people were not merely marking time. They were inhabiting it. They synchronized themselves with forces that extended beyond the immediate and tangible. Through observation, intention, and collective attention, the cycles of life, land, and spirit were honored simultaneously. The festivals were both anchor and compass, guiding communities through the complexities of survival, growth, and continuity. And as the night deepens and the mind grows calm, the memory of these cycles remains. The turning of a year, the rhythm of fire, water, and earth, the care taken in every gesture, all becomes a quiet structure beneath awareness. In this structure, humans and unseen forces meet. In it, life persists. In it, balance endures. Even as sleep draws the body and spirit into its gentle descent, the rhythm of the festivals whispers still, linking past and present, human and unseen, in a harmony that has guided life for generations. The arrival of Christianity in Slavic lands was not sudden, nor was it universally welcomed. It moved quietly at first, carried by travelers, traders, and missionaries who spoke of a different kind of order and a singular deity whose power exceeded that of the old gods. To the ancient Slavs, the change was subtle at first, like a shift in the wind that they could sense but not yet name. Their forests, rivers, and hearts had long been filled with familiar presences, spirits and deities who govern life, death, and the cycles of the year. Suddenly, a new force was whispering of different rules, of a world where familiar powers were no longer primary, and where some were considered dangerous or false. Christianity offered clarity that the old Slavic world did not. It promised absolutes, moral codes, and the authority of sacred texts. In contrast, the Slavic cosmos had been fluid, layered, and adaptive. Gods and spirits shifted roles across regions and generations. Actions were interpreted contextually, with consequences measured through balance rather than judgment. The Slavs did not deny the possibility of wrongdoing, but they understood life as a web of relationships rather than a binary of sin and virtue. The new religion, however, offered a single thread running through that web, claiming it as the only path. The transition was not merely intellectual, it was visceral. Villages that had long aligned themselves with the cycles of earth, water, and sky now faced a different set of expectations. Old rituals were questioned. Sacred groves were replaced by churches. Offerings to rivers and forests were sometimes condemned as pagan. Communities that had lived in harmony with unseen presences were told that those presences were either irrelevant or evil. The change was not immediate, but it was pervasive, like water seeping into soil over months and years, slowly altering its character. For some, the new order was attractive. Christianity offered protection in an unstable world. Aligning with a powerful, singular deity could bring social cohesion, political favor, or the promise of eternal life beyond death. Rulers and leaders often adopted the new faith first, seeing it as a way to consolidate power, unify their people, and gain legitimacy among neighbors who had already converted. Once the leaders embraced Christianity, Communities were encouraged, pressured, or coerced to follow, creating tension between the old ways and new expectations. The old gods did not vanish immediately, but their presence began to fade. Rituals that had been central to life, marking the seasons, honoring ancestors, or attending sacred spaces, were practiced less openly. Forests that had been carefully negotiated became sites of superstition or fear. Water spirits that had guided travelers and protected rivers were demonized. The careful, balanced understanding of the world that had persisted for generations was increasingly overshadowed by a moral framework that simplified ambiguity into right and wrong. This process was not uniform. In remote regions, old practices persisted for decades or even centuries. People maintained quiet rituals, whispered prayers, and secret offerings alongside their Christian observances. They found ways to incorporate both belief systems, sometimes blending elements of the old into the new. Names of saints replaced the names of familiar deities, but the roles remained similar, protecting hearth, field, or river, guiding travelers, and watching over life's transitions. In this way, the old gods were not entirely lost, but transformed, hidden beneath layers of reinterpretation. Conflict arose not only between belief systems, but within communities. Some individuals fully embraced a new faith, while others clung to older understandings. Families could be divided. Villages negotiated compromise, blending Christian festivals with seasonal observances inherited from the old ways. Winter solstice celebrations became Christmas. Spring fertility rites merged into Easter traditions, and local spirits were reframed as saints, demons, or neutral intermediaries. This syncretism allowed survival of cultural memory, but the meanings often shifted, losing their original nuance. The psychological impact on the Slavs was subtle but profound. Where once the world had been layered and responsive, now it became hierarchical and morally charged. Forces that had been respected for their unpredictability were now framed as obedient or disobedient. Humans were told they could now command the divine through faith and ritual obedience, rather than understanding and attentiveness. The relational model of the old cosmos gave way to a contractual one: belief, obedience, reward, punishment. This was comforting to some, alienating to others. The deep, intuitive engagement with the rhythms of life, the careful listening to rivers, forests, and winds, was replaced with rules and prohibitions. Still, the old understanding persisted in subtle ways. Folk customs, superstitions, and quiet practices maintained traces of the ancestral worldview. People continued to leave small offerings at springs or crossroads, to whisper names into the wind, to treat trees, animals, and water with careful respect. Even if these acts were reframed as folk tradition rather than divine interaction, they preserved a memory of a cosmos alive in ways the new faith could not fully eradicate. These remnants created continuity, a hidden thread connecting generations despite the overlay of Christian authority. Some scholars suggest that the Christianization of the Slavs was not a matter of conquest alone, but negotiation. The Church often incorporated local traditions to make conversion more palatable. Pagan holidays were renamed, sacred spaces were repurposed, and certain symbolic gestures were allowed to continue. This pragmatic approach acknowledged the depth of attachment to the old ways, even while asserting the supremacy of the new faith. In doing so, Christianity slowly reshaped culture without immediately destroying it, allowing elements of continuity to persist beneath the surface. The tension between old and new belief systems created a subtle narrative of loss. People had once spoken to spirits, observed sacred cycles, and moved carefully within layered realities, found themselves questioning what was safe or permissible. Some abandoned these practices entirely, fearing punishment or ostracism. Others continued quietly, embedding ancestral knowledge into the rhythms of daily life. The transition was not a single event, but a slow erosion, punctuated by resistance, adaptation, and selective memory. Death, which had once been a fluid continuation into layered existence, became framed increasingly in moral terms. Spirits of the dead were still acknowledged, but now they were subject to Christian interpretation. Saints or damned souls. Rituals around burial, remembrance, and seasonal observances were modified to align with Christian beliefs, even as echoes of the older practices remained. Ancestors became intermediaries. Prayers addressed the saints rather than natural forces, and offerings were recast as charitable acts or symbolic gestures rather than essential interactions with the unseen. Even as Christian framework solidified, traces of the old worldview influenced storytelling, folklore, and seasonal customs for generations. Tales of spirits, wandering mortals, and river guardians persisted, now framed with Christian moral undertones. Certain practices were tolerated as part of communal identity, recognized as harmless or even valuable for social cohesion. Yet, beneath these adaptations, the ancient Slavic understanding of a layered, responsive, and attentive world quietly endured, guiding subtle behaviors, instincts, and local customs. This gradual fading of the old gods did not happen without emotional resonance. Communities experienced loss alongside transformation. The forests, rivers, and hearths that had long been alive with unseen presences now seemed quieter, their voices mediated through the lens of Christian morality. The intimate, participatory relationship with nature and spirit was replaced by a structured, mediated understanding. Faith shifted from dialogue to declaration, from attentiveness to obedience. The transition was generational. Elders who had grown up within the old framework often struggled to reconcile the new structures with their lived experience. Children, educated within Christian norms, learned a simplified moral map of the world, leaving the nuanced, layered understanding of their ancestors increasingly distant. Over decades and centuries, the old worldview receded further, though not entirely, because traces remained in family memory, folk practices, and subconscious awareness. Despite the apparent triumph of Christianity, the transformation was neither complete nor uniform. Remote regions, isolated communities, and stubbornly persistent traditions ensured that the old ways survived, albeit quietly. These remnants were often practical, rooted in experience, knowing which river crossings were safest, which seasons demanded caution, how to prepare for storms or harsh winters. Even when framed within Christian belief, these practices maintained the original intent: attentiveness, balance, and respect for forces beyond immediate perception. Ultimately, the arrival of Christianity created a dual consciousness in Slavic culture. On one hand, there was a new moral, legal, and spiritual order, asserting authority and providing structure. On the other hand, the older understanding persisted subtly, embedded in custom, folklore, and everyday practice. People navigated this duality cautiously, integrating what was required by law and faith while preserving what was meaningful and necessary for survival and emotional continuity. The result was a complex cultural tapestry in which old and new coexisted uneasily. Forests and rivers retained echoes of their former life, even as saints were invoked over them. The hearth remained a center of quiet attentiveness, even as prayers were offered in Christian form. Rituals and festivals adapted, often blending ancestral significance with new theological frameworks. Through this interplay, the memory of the old God survived, hidden beneath the layers of conversion, waiting in quiet persistence for those who remembered to notice. In this sense, the story of the coming of Christianity is not simply one of conquest or replacement. It is a story of transformation, adaptation, and resilience. The old gods were not erased. They were reinterpreted, hidden, reframed, and sometimes forgotten, but their influence persisted in the habits, awareness, and cultural memory of the Slavic peoples. The world remained alive in subtle ways, layered and attentive, and the human connection to it endured, though expressed differently than before. Even centuries later, echoes of this transitional period can be felt in rituals, songs, and local customs. The careful placement of offerings, the attention to natural cycles, and the instinctive respect for rivers, forests, and hearths reflect a memory older than the dominant religious structures. Beneath Christian observance, the human psyche still carries traces of a world once governed by attentiveness, balance, and a layered understanding of life, death, and the unseen. And as the mind dwells on this transformation, it becomes clear that what was lost was not only practice, but perspective. The Slavs once lived within a world alive with forces that responded to attention, respect, and careful action. Christianity imposed a singular moral vision, offering clarity and protection, but at the cost of complexity and relational intimacy with the natural and unseen worlds. Yet the survival of memory, custom, and instinct demonstrates that even profound cultural shifts cannot entirely erase the patterns that once shaped daily life, guiding people quietly, attentively, and profoundly through the world. Even as the old gods faded into shadow under the steady spread of Christianity, they were not entirely lost. The ancient Slavic beliefs adapted, retreated, and concealed themselves within the customs, superstitions, and oral traditions of ordinary people. These remnants, woven into the everyday fabric of life, allowed the old gods and spirits to persist quietly, often unnoticed by outsiders, but vividly present in the lived experience of the communities that remembered them. Christianity had changed the narrative, but it could not erase memory, attention, or practice entirely. The old powers were neither gone nor defeated. They had learned to hide. One of the primary ways the old gods survived was through the reinterpretation of their functions into folk traditions. Deities who once commanded rivers, forests, and hearts were no longer openly worshipped, but their influence remained disguised. A water spirit might become a saint who protected wells, or a forest guardian might be reframed as a warning about straying too far into the woods at night. The essence of the old deities, their attentiveness, their moral neutrality, their insistence on respect, remained even if their forms and names changed. These subtle transformations allowed communities to honor the forces they depended upon without openly defying the new religious order. Seasonal rituals offered another avenue for survival. Christian holidays were mapped onto pre-existing cycles, often absorbing the timing and some of the symbolism of older festivals. The winter solstice became Christmas, while spring celebrations merged into Easter observances. Fire and light retained their significance, not as pagan symbols, but as markers of renewal and protection. Water, earth, and fertility rituals persisted in subtly altered forms: blessings on fields, careful attention to river crossings, or leaving small offerings at thresholds and crossroads. These customs function as bridges between old and new, preserving knowledge in a socially acceptable way while maintaining continuity with ancestral practices. Folk tales were a particularly powerful vehicle for persistence of the old gods. Stories of forest spirits, water guardians, and wandering mortals often carried moral, practical, and spiritual lessons that reflected ancient understandings of the world. Characters who mirrored old deities or spirits taught caution, humility, and attentiveness without directly invoking a pantheon that was increasingly discouraged. These tales instructed listeners in survival, respect for the natural world, and the subtleties of human behavior. Through storytelling, the old gods remained alive in the collective imagination, guiding action and shaping awareness even as their worship faded. Symbols and objects also preserved memory. Simple tokens, stones placed at crossroads, bread left by the hearth, water drawn from a spring at dawn, acted as conduits for interaction with forces that could no longer be addressed openly. People maintained these practices quietly, understanding their significance instinctively. Over generations, the purpose of some objects was forgotten, but the effect persisted. Protective, attentive, and responsive practices embedded in the rhythms of life continue to operate. In this way, the old gods survived as patterns of action and awareness rather than as named entities. Even language carried traces. Certain words, phrases, and names remained in common use long after their divine reference were abandoned. Whispered prayers, exclamations, or blessings often invoke protective or generative forces in ways that reflected ancient cosmology. A phrase to ward off misfortune, a blessing for safe travel, or a song sung to encourage growth in fields carried with it centuries of tacit knowledge. In this sense, speech itself became a form of survival, encoding wisdom and acknowledgement of the unseen in everyday communication. The old gods were also preserved in liminality, the spaces and moments that existed at the edges of daily life. Crossroads, forests, rivers, wells, and thresholds retained significance because they were historically points where the human and unseen worlds intersected. Even as explicit worship declined, caution and attentiveness continued. People still paused at rivers, approached forests carefully, and left tokens at thresholds. These practices did not always carry explicit spiritual significance for later generations, but their form and function echoed the instructions of ancestors, ensuring continuity. Dreams were another subtle arena where the old gods persisted. Even within a Christian framework, people continued to experience, interpret, and respond to dreams in ways that reflected ancient Slavic understanding. Dreams of rivers, forests, or ancestors were sometimes regarded as warnings, guidance, or messages. Though the cosmology might have been reframed, the underlying principle endured. Sleep was a liminal state, attentive observation mattered, and actions in the waking world could affect outcomes in subtle, unseen ways. Healing practices were particularly resilient. The knowledge embedded in herb gathering, preparation of remedies, and ritualized treatment of illness carried deep echoes of pre-Christian thought. Even when reinterpreted to the lens of Christian saints or divine intercession, these practices retained their underlying logic. Careful observation, respectful treatment of natural forces, and alignment with broader rhythms were necessary for effectiveness. The underlying awareness of balance and consequence survived, encoded in techniques, timing, and gestures. The preservation of these practices was not always conscious. Communities often continue behaviors because they worked, because they provided comfort, protection, or social cohesion, even if the original cosmological rationale was partially forgotten. Knowledge became practical wisdom, embedded in habit, routine, and tacit understanding. Children learned these practices as normal, absorbing the principles of attentiveness, respect, and relational awareness without formal instruction. Even negative forces retained their subtle influence. Spirits once considered morally neutral or situationally dangerous were reframed as malevolent, mischievous, or cautionary figures. Folk tales about forest or water spirits that could mislead, harm, or test humans carried echoes of older cosmology. These figures were not punished for being what they were. Rather, human behavior was guided to maintain balance and attentiveness, reflecting the principles embedded in older belief systems. In this way, the cautionary dimensions of the old god persisted, shaping behavior and perception subtly yet powerfully. The blending of old and new beliefs produced a dual consciousness in everyday life. On one level, people adhered to Christian teachings, celebrated sanctioned holidays, and observed moral codes imposed by church authority. On another, they maintained awareness of ancestral patterns, practiced subtle rituals, and engaged with liminal spaces with care and respect. This duality allowed the old gods to survive without confrontation, embedded in the actions, rhythms, and social structures of everyday life. Even as centuries passed, memory persisted in cultural expression. Music, dance, and folk art carried echoes of the old cosmology. Motifs representing forests, rivers, celestial bodies, and cycles of life appeared repeatedly in patterns, suggesting an enduring relationship with forces once worshipped openly. These artistic expressions did more than decorate. They encoded cultural knowledge, ensuring that principles of balance, attentiveness, and relational understanding were transmitted across generations. The persistence of the old gods was also evident in collective intuition and perception. People instinctively respected forests, paused at rivers, or approached fire with care, often without consciously acknowledging why. These habits reflected embedded knowledge, lessons accumulated over centuries about the world's responsiveness and the consequences of attention or neglect. Even in a society overtly dominated by Christian doctrine, these instincts maintained continuity with the ancestral worldview. Even centuries after the arrival of Christianity and the gradual fading of the openly worshipped old Slavic gods, their presence continues to ripple through memory, culture, and collective consciousness. These remnants are subtle, woven into folklore, customs, seasonal cycles, and even the landscape itself. They persist not only as traces of belief, but as enduring influences on how people perceive the world, interact with their environment, and interpret their place within it. To understand Slavic myths in modern memory and culture is to recognize how deeply embedded these patterns remain, often in ways that are almost imperceptible, yet profoundly shaping experience. One of the most evident ways Slavic myths survive today is through folklore. Stories passed down through generations continue to reflect ancient cosmology, albeit filtered and transformed by centuries of cultural change. Forests remain spaces of mystery, rivers carry a sense of hidden memory, and certain animals continue to be imbued with symbolic significance. The old gods, though no longer worshipped as deities, live on through their actions and qualities encoded in narrative. Water spirits, forest guardians, and liminal beings appear as characters in tales that educate, entertain, and preserve moral and practical lessons. Children grow up hearing these stories, learning to respect the natural world, understand cause and effect, and approach life with cautious attentiveness, all echoes of a worldview that predates formal written history. Modern adaptations often obscure the original intent, but the underlying principles remain. Heroes in these stories, both human and divine, are tested by forces beyond their immediate understanding. The trials they face are rarely about defeating evil outright, but about learning to navigate complexity, balance personal desire with communal responsibility, and respect boundaries that extend beyond human perception. Even contemporary retellings, whether in literature, film, or gaming, carry fragments of these ancient lessons. The narratives preserve an awareness that the world is layered, interactive, and morally nuanced, even if the characters and settings have been altered to suit modern tastes. Seasonal and cultural festivals continue to reflect ancient Slavic rhythms, though their original meanings have often been transformed or absorbed into Christian observances. Winter solstice celebrations, spring planting rituals, and harvest festivals remain part of regional traditions, though they may now be framed around saints' days or national holidays. Yet the underlying patterns, the acknowledgement of cycles, the care taken to mark transitions, the communal reinforcement of balance between humans and environment remain intact. Even when participants are unaware of the origins, their actions echo centuries of understanding about the interconnectedness of life, nature, and the unseen world. Language itself carries subtle remnants of the old myths. Idioms, proverbs, and even casual speech often contain references to concepts, animals, or natural phenomena that were once central to Slavic cosmology. To speak of a river being angry, or to caution someone about wandering into a forest, is more than poetic. It reflects an inherited awareness that the natural world is agency, memory, and consequence. These linguistic remnants maintain a cognitive and emotional link to ancient thought patterns, encoding attentiveness and respect into daily communication. Landscapes themselves bear traces of the old mythology. Certain trees, hills, rivers, and springs are still treated with a mixture of reverence and caution, often regarded as sites where unseen forces are more accessible or powerful. Even when framed through Christian or secular perspectives, the instinctive awareness of special places reflects centuries of accumulated knowledge about liminal spaces, thresholds, and points of interaction between human and supernatural realms. Hiking through a deep forest, pausing beside a river, or approaching a solitary hilltop can evoke a sense of attentiveness and humility reminiscent of ancestral practice, even without conscious recognition. Ritualized practices in daily life also preserve elements of the old worldview. Small gestures of protection, care, and acknowledgement continue to shape behavior. Crossing a river cautiously, leaving bread on a windowsill, or performing a quiet blessing before embarking on a journey are actions steeped in tradition, reflecting long-standing understandings of balance, consequence, and relational awareness. These habits operate on a subconscious level, maintaining the cognitive structures of an ancient belief system while outwardly conforming to contemporary cultural norms. Even in literature, art, and performance, Slavic myths continue to exert influence. Folklore collections, historical novels, fantasy literature, and cinematic adaptations often draw upon ancient narratives, symbols, and archetypes. The motifs of water spirits, forest guardians, and liminal heroes persist as metaphors for human experience, moral complexity, and the unseen forces that shape life. Artistic representation allows the myths to evolve, while preserving their emotional resonance and structural integrity. Through these forms, audiences reconnect with the rhythm and logic of a world that is layered, attentive, and morally subtle, even if mediated through modern interpretation. Psychologically, these myths influence perception and intuition. People continue to experience spaces and events as subtly alive, as if being observed or guided by unseen presences. The instinct to pause at a riverbank, to treat a forest with caution, or to notice unusual patterns in nature is inherited from centuries of cultural memory. Such awareness is not supernatural, but is informed by the cognitive frameworks and practices developed in a worldview that regarded all things as interconnected and consequential. In this sense, the myths persist not only in stories, but in lived experience, shaping attention, judgment, and behavior. Rituals surrounding life transitions, birth, marriage, death, also reflect the enduring influence of Slavic myth. While Christian or secular frameworks often dominate, many practices retain echoes of ancient cosmology. Protective gestures, careful timing, and attention to natural forces continue to inform behaviors surrounding these events. The underlying logic, that human actions interact with unseen forces, and that balance and attentiveness shape outcomes, remains central, even when religious interpretation differs. The persistence of these patterns demonstrates the resilience of cultural memory, capable of adapting to new contexts while preserving foundational principles. The resurgence of interest in Slavic mythology in modern media, literature, and scholarly research further reinforces its presence in contemporary consciousness. Artists, writers, and filmmakers draw upon the old narratives, exploring the layered world of gods, spirits, and human interactions with the unseen. Through reinterpretation, these myths reach new audiences, fostering an appreciation for ancestral cosmology and its subtle wisdom. Even as popular adaptations may romanticize or fictionalize elements, they contribute to the survival of core ideas: attentiveness, balance, and the relational understanding of humans within a responsive world. Contemporary festivals and folk celebrations often incorporate reconstructed or preserved elements of old practices. Seasonal events may include fire rituals, processions near rivers, or symbolic offerings to fields and forests. While framed within cultural heritage or national identity, these practices maintain the fundamental principles of relational awareness and attentiveness to cycles. Participants may not explicitly invoke ancient deities, but their engagement with rhythm, seasonality, and environmental interaction preserves a memory and logic of ancestral belief systems. The influence of these myths extends even to language, thought, and worldview. Concepts of fate, consequence, and relational responsibility, central to Slavic mythology, remain embedded in cultural attitudes and moral frameworks. The narratives of interaction between humans and the divine, between mortals and the unseen, continue to shape ethical reasoning, social norms, and environmental consciousness. In many cases, these influences operate subconsciously, guiding behavior and perception without explicit acknowledgement. Modern literature and scholarship reveal patterns that link contemporary cultural expression with ancient mythic structures. Folk songs, poetry, and storytelling retain narrative structures that mirror Slavic cosmology. Heroes encountering forces beyond understanding, moral consequences emerging through action, and liminal spaces serving as thresholds for transformation. The endurance of these narrative patterns demonstrates the adaptability of myth, its ability to persist and influence thought, even under the overlay of new religious or secular paradigms. Urban environments, too, reflect subtle traces of these myths. Rivers, parks, and forests within cities continue to evoke caution, reverence, or curiosity. As the seasons pass and time slips silently forward, the ancient Slavic world, with its deep connections to nature, spirits, and cycles, fades into the quiet echoes of history. Yet even in the silence, there is an unmistakable sense that something still listens, still remembers. The world, alive with forces both seen and unseen, continues to speak, but now it speaks in whispers, through the rustle of trees, the flow of rivers, the glow of moonlight, and the stillness of the night. It is a reminder that the old world is never truly gone. It lingers beneath the surface, waiting patiently for those who are willing to listen, to remember, and understand the deep currents of existence that flow through both the land and the spirit. The silence of the modern world, filled with noise and distraction, cannot fully drown out the ancient rhythms that once guided daily life. People, even in the most urbanized areas, find themselves drawn to nature in ways they cannot always explain. There's a pull toward the forest, the river, the quiet of the night, and the space where the earth meets the sky. It is as though something deep within the human soul recognizes the old patterns, the old wisdom, and feels an instinctive need to reconnect with them, to find balance once more in a world that has grown far too disconnected from the natural forces that shaped it. Night itself holds a particular kind of magic. As the darkness settles over the land, a quiet transformation takes place. The familiar world of day, with its clarity and order, slips into the uncertainty of the night, where shadows dance and silence speaks. The ancient Slavs understood this transition as more than a simple change in the hours of the day. Night was a time when the veil between the known and the unknown thinned, a time when spirits could more easily walk among the living, and when the forces that shaped existence could be felt most acutely. It was a time of both mystery and opportunity, a time when the boundaries between life and death, between the material and the spiritual, seemed less fixed. In the stillness of night, the old world whispers through the rustling leaves, the flow of distant rivers, the cool air that moves through the trees. The ancient spirits of the forest, the river guardians and the watchers of the hearth are not gone, but exist in a form that requires attention, reverence, and care. The landscape itself is alive with memory, with the stories of ancestors, with the presence of beings who once interacted directly with the living. In this silence, the ancient gods and spirits are not absent, but waiting, watching, and listening. Perhaps the most profound way in which these ancient forces linger is in the way the landscape continues to speak. The forests, rivers, and mountains still hold their power, still evoke the same feelings of awe and respect that they once did. People who walk into the woods still feel that sense of something greater, something older, watching them from the shadows. The sound of a river flowing, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the scent of damp earth, all of these elements still stir something deep inside, something that recognizes the world as alive, interconnected, and full of meaning. In the quiet moments when the mind slows, when distractions fall away, there's a sense that the landscape is not just a backdrop to human life, but a living entity in its own right. The trees, the rivers, the rocks, they all carry memory, they all carry stories. This is not an intellectual understanding, but an instinctual one. The ancient Slavs did not see the world as a collection of separate objects, but as an interconnected whole, where everything had a role to play, a purpose, and a relationship with everything else. The forest was not simply a place to gather wood. The river was not just a source of water. It was a sacred space, a living presence that required respect, care, and understanding. In today's world, many people have lost touch with this deeper understanding of the land, and yet the urge to reconnect remains strong. People still seek out nature, still feel the pull of the forest, the river, and the quiet spaces where the world feels more alive. It is in these moments that the ancient world speaks most clearly, through a sense of peace, a sense of wonder, and a recognition that the world is more than it seems. In the stillness of nature, the whispers of the old gods and spirits can be heard once again. Even in the heart of cities, people find themselves drawn to natural spaces, to parks, riversides, or any place where the rhythms of nature still assert themselves. These places become sanctuaries, spaces where people can pause, breathe, and reconnect with the deeper currents of life. In these spaces, people feel something beyond the rush of daily life, a sense of connection to something older, something more enduring. The forest no longer seems like a distant mythical place, but a real, tangible presence that is just waiting to be noticed, waiting to be acknowledged. And perhaps that is the key to understanding why these ancient beliefs, these old gods, continue to echo through the present day. They were never about domination or control. They were about respect, balance, and attentiveness. The gods of the Slavic world did not require blind obedience or worship. They asked only for acknowledgement and care. They asked to be listened to, not as distant deities, but as forces that existed within the world, shaping it as much as they were shaped by it. The ancient worldview was one of reciprocity, a shared existence between humans and the world around them, where each action, each decision, had consequences that rippled out into the world. In a modern world that often feels fragmented and disconnected, the need for this kind of reciprocity is more pressing than ever. People today are not disconnected from nature because they are unwilling to connect, but because they have forgotten how to listen. The ancient Slavs lived in a world where every sound, every movement, every change in the wind carried meaning. The modern world, with its noise and distractions, has drowned out these whispers, but they have not vanished. They are still there, waiting for those who are willing to listen, waiting for those who are willing to reconnect with the old ways of seeing the world. As people begin to reconnect with nature, there is a resurgence of interest in the old practices, the old ways of thinking. People return to traditions of seasonal observances, of recognizing the changing of a year and its deeper significance. People are once again recognizing the importance of balance, of reciprocity, and of the interconnectedness of life. The ancient Slavic gods may not be worshipped in the way they once were, but their wisdom about balance, humility, attentiveness, and respect remains as relevant as ever. The echoes of the past are not merely relics to be studied. They are living lessons, waiting to guide us once again. The forest, the river, the hearth, these spaces continue to speak. Their messages may be quieter now, but they are no less powerful. The earth is not an inert backdrop to human life. It is alive, responsive, and deeply interconnected with everything that lives upon it. The ancient rhythms of nature still guide us, whether we recognize them consciously or not. And as the modern world continues to shift, the wisdom of the past remains a steady presence, waiting for those who are willing to listen and remember. It is in the silence of the forest, the quiet murmur of the river, and the stillness of the night that the old world continues to speak. It is not an overt message, not a direct command, but a whisper, a feeling, a presence that reminds us that we are part of something larger. The gods, the spirits, the forces that once guided the Slavic people have not disappeared. They are waiting, not to impose their will, but to guide those who are willing to listen, to respect, and to live in harmony with the world around them. The old gods, with their deep knowledge of balance, reciprocity, and attentiveness, are alive in the spaces between things, between day and night, between the seasons, between life and death. They exist not as figures to be worshipped, but as forces to be respected. They live in the rhythms of nature, in the quiet whispers of the world around us. And as the world continues to turn, they remain, waiting to guide us back to the rhythms that once shaped our lives and the lives of our ancestors.